Why did the Constitution count enslaved people as 3/5 of a person? In Federalist number 54, we believe it's James Madison who's trying to explain this. Under the pen name of Publius, we can assume that it's Madison, but we're not 100% sure. And in this essay, the explanation is not to defend slavery itself, but instead to defend a compromise that the Constitution needed in order for it to exist at all. And so this essay forces us to confront the difference between what is moral and what was politically possible in 1787. I'm Matt Hasquin. I'm a high school history and civics teacher, and I like to talk about things we should know, and we've been making a journey through the Federalist Papers, and we're up to number 54 now, on our way to number 85. So let's go ahead and set the stage for number 54. One of the ugliest parts of the Constitution was the 3/5 compromise. And the 3/5 compromise determined how states would count population for representation in the House of Representatives and also direct taxes. And southern states wanted enslaved people counted as full persons. That way they could increase their political power in the House. Northern states argued that they shouldn't be counted, enslaved people shouldn't be counted at all, because those same enslaved people had no rights, no freedoms, and no representation. And the delegates in the Constitutional Convention were deadlocked. The Union, which was barely born yet, was already at risk, and the convention was, in danger of shutting down. And so the 3/5 formula became the bargaining chip that held the Constitutional Convention together. Now, Madison is doing something specific here. He isn't necessarily justifying slavery. He's explaining why the compromise exists in the Constitution and why the Constitution can only survive with all 13 states on board. And his argument is something like this. A Constitution must deal with the country as it is. That way, it's in order to create conditions for the country to become what it could or should be. Now, his core argument is that, well, one, his central point is uncomfortable, but I think there's an essential nature to understanding it. Enslaved people were treated by Southern law as persons for the purposes of crimes, because they could be punished, but they are treated as property for the purposes of ownership, because they were bought, they were sold, and they were inherited. This legal contradiction is what Madison used to explain why the compromise exists. Not to praise it, not to excuse it, but to show the Constitution it actually had to work with different state laws that treated enslaved people inconsistently. He wrote in the essay, "The laws of the states regard them as both persons and property." So, therefore, the 3/5 ratio was a political formula born out of that inconsistent reality. So, the representation problem is this. When we get to the compromise under the Virginia Plan that takes us to the Great Compromise, representation in the House was based on population. It still is. And at the time, if enslaved people counted fully, southern states gained enormous political power, but enslaved people get no actual representation. And so if enslaved people were not counted at all, northern states gained more power, but the South refuses to ratify the Constitution. And so Madison's defense is not moral, it's more mechanical. The Union cannot form without a number both sides accept. And 3/5 was the compromise between 0 and full representation of people who had no rights or no voice. Now, Madison argues that the compromise is at least logically consistent because, well, one, representation and taxation. And those are all tied to the same population formula. If a state wants more seats in Congress, it also must pay more taxes. This dual pressure, he says, keeps the system fair within its own logic. Again, he's not defending slavery per se. He's explaining an internal formula created to satisfy the opposing regional interests. Now, Madison does openly acknowledge that the compromise reflects state laws, not a moral truth. He knows slavery contradicts the principles of the Revolution. He knows it's unjust. But in Federalist 54, he argues the Constitution must begin with political reality in order to survive long enough to change that reality. So the Constitution was born in contradiction because The country was born in contradiction. So, that brings us to Madison's logic, his chain of reasoning, our 5 reasons why for this particular essay. First, states treated enslaved people as both persons and property. Then, representation in taxes needed a uniform method. Counting enslaved people fully would unfairly empower slave states, and counting them as 0 would cause the South to reject the Constitution. The 3/5 rule became the compromise necessary to create the Constitution and the Union. And so there's the Federalist number 54 in 5 easy steps. Madison's tone through this essay is probably the least celebratory of the Federalist Papers, because Madison isn't proud, he isn't poetic, and he doesn't really invoke the ideals of liberty in this essay. But he speaks more as like this political surgeon that's trying to keep a fragile nation alive long enough to confront its own disease. So it's not necessarily a defense of slavery. It is a defense of union, no matter how ugly it is. Now, here is the painful truth. The compromise gave slave states political power. That prolonged slavery, that power prolonged slavery for decades to come. It also created the very government that would later abolish slavery. And that contradiction sits at the center of American history. So understanding Federalist 54 means recognizing 2 things. 1, the Constitution was born from moral tragedy, and 2, it still created the structure that eventually destroyed that tragedy. So both can be true at once. Now, today, we have debates today about things like representation and population counts and voting access and political power imbalances and representation in the House, and all these things trace back to the struggle at the founding over who counts and on what terms. And so the question of the 3/5 compromise, the question that it failed to answer was, how do you represent a people who are denied humanity? So our 3 takeaways here. 1, Federalist 54 explains the political, not the moral logic of the 3/5 compromise. 2, the Constitution was forced to accommodate slavery to secure national unity. And 3, the tension between American ideals and American realities began at the founding, and it continues today. Federalist 54 is the most difficult of the papers because, well, it confronts the greatest contradiction in American history. And so Madison does not necessarily celebrate this compromise. He explains this almost tragic math that held the nation together. It held it together long enough for future generations to finish the work of justice. So understanding number 54 is not about agreeing with it. It's about seeing clearly how those flawed choices they made helped shape the new nation, and then how those flaws continue to reverberate or echo into our own time. I'm Matt Hasquin, and this is one of those things we should just know by being alive. On this episode, if it helped you understand the complexity and the consequences and just the overall ugliness of the 3/5 compromise, please take some time to share this, follow along with me, but hang around. I'm going to be coming up with number 55 tomorrow, and this is where Madison turns from population to the ideal size of Congress itself, talking about the overall structure of Congress with the House and the Senate. Thanks for hanging around with this one. It was kind of long.